Hi everyone, in this video we're going to take a look at the process for creating custom brush presets in Photoshop. For those of you doing colouring in Photoshop, you'll be able to use brush presets for shading your turnaround images, and you'll be able to obviously then use them in further future projects that you might be doing in Photoshop as well. There are similar processes for doing this kind of thing in other software. For brush stroke presets and things like that, but we'll just take a look at Photoshop. It's pretty accessible. So to create a brush preset, what we're going to do is create a new document. We'll just go to File, New, and what we want to do is set up basically a blank document with a document width and height set to pixels, and what we want to do is set this to a maximum of about 5,000 if you're working with the current version of Adobe Photoshop, the CC version for 2020. If you're working on older versions of Photoshop, like Creative Suite CS6 for instance, I use that at home sometimes, you will probably need to set it to a maximum of 2,500 pixels, so 2,500 pixels. I'm going to set it at that anyway, just out of habit. The reason for that is that your brush tool, depending on the version of Photoshop, the brush tool can go up to a maximum size of either 2,500 or 5,000 pixels. So I'm just going to set mine to 2,500. Like that for width and height. I don't want to use artboards, so just make sure that's unticked. It's the same width and height, so it doesn't matter if the orientation is set to portrait or landscape because it's going to be a square. Resolution, we can probably ignore that for now, and everything else can pretty much remain as it is. If you want, you can actually turn the background contents to transparent, but you can also leave it on white. You only want to use one of those two settings, white or transparent. And then we'll just hit create. There we go. So basically, to create a preset, what we want to do is create some form of pattern inside this document. Now, really, the size that you're drawing the pattern at will kind of indicate the maximum size you can make your brush when you're using that preset. So if your pattern goes right to the extent of this document, the maximum size that you can use that brush and have it retain its clarity is 2,500 pixels, because that's how big this document is. If you make it bigger, technically it can go bigger if you're using Creative Cloud 2020, but the edges of your brush will start to pixelate and become fuzzy. So it's sort of a resolution type issue. Basically, your brush presets are essentially based on an image map that it's basically projecting through the brush tool. So just like if you take a normal, say, photograph and you increase the size of it inside Photoshop or maybe InDesign, once it gets bigger than its original size, it'll start to pixelate and become blurry. So it's the same issue with these kinds of brush presets. So what we can do is just use any of the tools that we'd normally have available to us in Photoshop, and we can create a pattern inside here. Now, one of the things we need to be aware of is we want to use grayscale pixels. So in other words, black, white, or grey. White, pure white, will come out completely transparent in the brush preset. Grey, any grey tone will be semi-transparent. The closer to white it is, the more transparent it is. And black will be completely opaque, or it will be solid, essentially. So as an example, if I have this brush and I create a few blobs, because of the brush preset that I'm using, or the brush settings I'm using at the moment, this brush has a slight transparency to it if you don't push down hard with the stylus. If I use a mouse and just click once, you can see that it gives me a semi-transparent grey, but if I draw back and forth over the same area, it will give me a solid colour. Okay, so once I've got the pattern that I want for my brush, if I come up to edit and then down to define brush preset just here, it'll give me this little option, and you can see that it's actually put in the number of pixels based on how wide and how tall this image is inside the document. So it's essentially only reading the area where I drew, and it's sort of cropping that bounding box down to the pixels I've drawn. So I can just call this test brush, give it a number, and then I can hit OK. And you can see when you do that, it now sets your brush tool to that preset, and you can see the preset, whoops, just up in the corner here, just here. Okay, so if I let me just jump out of this. If I just create a new document and just go with something like, say, 4, okay, I can now draw with that, and you can see that it's giving me that stepped setting. Now, what it's doing is it's taking the pattern that I drew and it's applying that to a brush where everything else is the default brush settings. So you can see that it's very stepped. It's applying the brush in sort of these dots, and in order to adjust this further, what I need to do is come into my brush settings. So if I go Window, Brush Settings, that's going to pop this panel open. You can see that it's dropped my preset there into the collection of brushes I've got. What I can do is come into these settings in here and adjust how this functions. So the first thing I'm going to do, you can see it's defaulted to that 1730 pixels. What I'm going to do is drop the brush size down so that it's a little bit more usable, like this. Okay, so I can do like a test line with that. And if I zoom in on that a little bit, so you can see it's still drawing with this staggered kind of line. All right. If I drop the spacing down, it will stop that from happening, and it will now draw as a series of smooth strokes. Okay, but that's maybe not what I want. Maybe what I want to do is increase the spacing. So now when I draw, it applies them like that. Now, some of the main things that we can do with this at a basic level is, if we go into Shape Dynamics, we can change the size that the brush draws at randomly. So if you increase the size jitter, what it's going to do is it's going to change the size that each of those points draws at. Okay, so some are bigger and some are smaller. Sometimes it's hard to see unless you increase the spacing up quite a lot. Okay, so you just keep adjusting the settings until you're happy with the way it's working. So some of them are smaller, you can see here, some are smaller and some are bigger with the size jitter. And that's regardless of how hard you're pushing down. So you can see we've got small one at the beginning, a few larger ones, and then it goes smaller again. So if I just draw a straight line across here, see how it's sort of randomizing the size of those. Some are bigger, some are smaller. We can also change the angle just here. So if I increase the angle jitter, what this is going to do is it's going to randomly spin them so that they come out at different angles. So I can start to randomize the stroke a little bit more. I can come to scattering, and what scattering does is it spaces the pattern out on either side of the line that I'm drawing with the mouse or with the cursor, with the stylus. So if I increase the scatter, you can see now if I draw, let me just clear that. If I draw now just straight across the page, you can see it's actually drawing above and below randomly the line that I'm drawing. So if I drop the amount of scatter down a little bit and I draw now, you can see it's kind of keeping it a little bit closer to where I'm drawing. So I can drop the scatter down even more. And now it's giving me, you know, sort of a pattern that's a little bit more controllable. If you tick both axes, okay, it actually shifts them left and right as well as up and down off where your cursor position is. So what this will do is it will also space them sort of before and after where your brush cursor is on the screen. So it starts to overlap them a bit more. You can also increase how many times it stamps by increasing the count. And what that's going to do is make it much denser. So it basically stamps each of those patterns more often, like this. And then we can also increase the count jitter as well. So it changes the number of times it stamps randomly, which will create a little bit more of a patchwork. So we can produce all sorts of different presets just by changing a few settings. We can also use things like transfer in order to reduce the opacity. You can see here the opacity jitter is set to 10% already. If I turn that off and then draw, you're going to get a lot less transparent variation. So there's a whole range of different things you can do. I won't go through all the settings here, but you know, you can experiment with them. And once you're kind of happy with a preset setting that you've done here, like this, what you can actually do is save those settings as a new brush. So usually you can save, sometimes you can save things from this little menu at the top here, and what we can do is go new brush preset just there, and it's the same as this button down here, which is also create new brush. So if I click that, I can then give it a name. You can also see here capture brush size in the preset. So if you've got that active, what it'll do is take the size that you've got in the settings here as the basic default size for the brush. Sometimes what you can do is actually have certain brushes locked to a particular size. So some of the presets that you'll find that come supplied with Photoshop are size locked, so you can't adjust the size, and some of them you can actually adjust up and down. So what I might do is call this one Speckle Paving, and I might put the brush size in as well into the name so I can see how big it is. If you've got colors set up within the brush, so you know, if we've been brushing with a particular color, you can tick include color so that it'll always be that particular brush preset. So for instance, if you do a lot of grass or sort of bushes and things like that, if you do a lot of landscapes, you can have those colors kind of preset in there as well. So I'll just OK, and there's my little preset just there, test brush 1. Okay, so if I go to this one, you can see it's going to do that, and then if I go back to this one, it's going to take me back to there. Okay. Now you can see that I've got my, if I go to the brushes panel, I've got the brushes, the two brushes I've created are down here at the bottom, and they're not in a group like these other brushes are. Let me just bring that out. So what I can do is create a new group for my brushes and put those in. So let me just collapse that one. So I'm going to create a group like this. I'm going to call it Let's just call this Simon's Customs. Just hit OK. There it is there. And then what I can do is drag this down into there. Now this test brush one, I don't really need that because that was sort of just the pattern that I used to get this other brush. So what I could do probably is just get rid of that one. Just say OK. And now what I can do is just use this little speckle brush. And obviously I can then, you know, dial the settings up and down as I liked, because I didn't, when I saved this preset, I didn't capture the size. I didn't tick the size option so that it always stays at this size. Okay, so that's how you create custom brushes. You can also do custom patterns that you can use with some of the other tools, I think, like things like the fill tool and some of your layer effect options and so on. It works in a similar fashion, except what you'd be doing is using the define pattern option instead of the define brush preset. So the only other thing to keep in mind is if you use like grey tones within this initial setup document, that will give you semi-transparent parts of the brush. Okay, so if it's solid black, it should give you essentially a non-see-through option or tone, and if it's any kind of grey, it'll give you increasingly transparent sections in the brush. So I'll leave that here, and I'll see you all soon.